The recent release of a climate report by the Energy Department has stirred significant debate, particularly as it coincides with the Environmental Protection Agency's (EPA) decision to roll back climate regulations across the federal landscape. This report, which claims to provide a critical review of climate science, has been met with skepticism from the scientific community, as it was authored by researchers who are known for their critical stance on mainstream climate science. Critics argue that the report is filled with inaccuracies and selectively presents data to support its conclusions. Zeke Hausfather, a climate scientist and the climate research lead at Stripe, expressed his concerns in a text message, stating, "They cherry-pick data points that suit their narratives and exclude the vast majority of the scientific literature that does not. This gives a terribly skewed view of the underlying climate science." This raises an important question. How can we trust a report that seems to ignore the broader scientific consensus? The draft of this report will be available for public commentary for a period of 30 days before it is finalized. John Christie, a climatologist at the University of Alabama and the lead author of the study, mentioned in an email, "We are gearing up for the public comments. If we've made mistakes, we will fix them for the final version." This openness to feedback is crucial, but it also highlights the potential for significant revisions based on public and scientific scrutiny. An Energy Department spokesperson defended the report, stating, "The Climate Working Group report is a much-needed re-evaluation of what climate science tells us and what it doesn't." However, the validity of this re-evaluation is under intense scrutiny. The Washington Post has taken the initiative to annotate key sections of the report with insights from climate scientists, revealing the contentious nature of its findings. The report was produced in less than 2 months by a small group of 5 authors, all of whom are recognized for their skeptical views on climate science. Andrew Dessler, a climate scientist at Texas A&M University, remarked, "If almost any other group of scientists had been chosen, the report would have been dramatically different." Christy Eby, a professor of global health at the University of Washington, pointed out that some authors have a history of cherry-picking data to support their claims, often neglecting to provide the necessary evidence. Judith Curry, a climatologist and professor emerita at the Georgia Institute of Technology, responded to her characterization as a climate skeptic by stating, "Any scientist that isn't skeptical isn't doing their job." She further argued that the mainstream scientific community's push for a consensus often serves political ends rather than scientific inquiry. One of the report's claims is that the increasing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has a beneficial effect on plant growth, promoting what is referred to as global greening. However, this assertion fails to consider the detrimental impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, such as rising temperatures leading to droughts and increased stress on crops. Ben Sanderson, a climate scientist at the Center for International Climate Research in Oslo, emphasized that while CO2's role in plant growth is well established, the report selectively highlights this aspect, while ignoring the broader, more complex discussions surrounding climate change's effects on vegetation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has stated with high confidence that warming is negatively affecting the quality and stability of crop and grassland yields. This brings us to a critical point. Can we afford to overlook the multifaceted impacts of climate change in favor of a simplified narrative? The report also suggests that climate models often predict higher temperatures than what has been observed. While it is true that some models may run hot, scientists have noted that the IPCC has acknowledged this limitation and has made efforts to prioritize models that align more closely with actual observations. Hausfather noted that recent years of record heat have brought observed temperatures more in line with model predictions, suggesting that the current rate of warming is consistent with central estimates from the latest generation of models. Moreover, the report has been criticized for taking research out of context. For instance, it cites a figure from one of Hausfather's papers to argue that models have historically outpaced observations, while the paper itself contends that models have been quite accurate in predicting global temperature changes. This raises an important question. How can we ensure that scientific findings are presented accurately and comprehensively? When discussing extreme weather, the report claims that most types show no statistically significant long-term trends. However, many climate scientists argue that this assertion is misleading and overlooks a growing body of evidence indicating an increase in extreme weather events such as floods, droughts, and heat waves. Michael Mann, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, stated, "We are seeing an increase in the incidence of floods, droughts, and heat waves, and if anything, climate models are probably underestimating the impact human-caused warming is having on these events." Jim Cosson, a former NOAA scientist, pointed out that significant trends have been identified in how quickly tropical cyclones intensify and their peak intensities. Contradicting the report's claims, he emphasized that the focus should not solely be on storm frequency, but rather on the changing risk landscape as a whole. This perspective invites us to consider, are we fully grasping the implications of climate change on extreme weather patterns? Kerry Emanuel, a meteorology professor at MIT, echoed these sentiments, criticizing the report for its limited view of hurricane impacts. He noted that while it discussed hurricanes making landfall, it failed to address the significant damage and mortality caused by rain and flooding associated with tropical cyclones. This omission raises concerns about the completeness of the report's analysis. The report also discusses temperature extremes, noting that changes in warm extremes are more complex than those in cold extremes. While some areas in the West have seen increases in the warmest daily temperatures, many locations east of the Rocky Mountains have experienced decreases. Eby cautioned that the report presents this information without adequate context, cherry-picking specific geographic regions and years to support its claims. This leads to a broader question. How can we accurately represent the diverse impacts of climate change across different regions? In terms of health impacts, the report discusses mortality related to temperature extremes, but John Balbus, a physician and former director of the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity, criticized the report for its inaccuracies. He pointed out that respiratory, heart, and kidney diseases are the primary health threats during extreme heat events, rather than heat stroke or exhaustion. This highlights the need for a nuanced understanding of how climate change affects public health. Finally, the report touches on the global climate impacts of U.S. emissions policies, suggesting that compliance with the Paris Accord would have minimal effects on global warming. However, this view is largely rejected by mainstream climate scientists, who argue that the commitments made under the Paris Agreement have already played a significant role in slowing projected global warming. Daniel Schrag, a professor at Harvard, emphasized that U.S. emissions targets are influencing other nations to enhance their own emissions reductions and adopt cleaner technologies. In conclusion, while the Energy Department's report presents a controversial perspective on climate science, it is essential to approach its findings with a critical eye. The potential for this report to serve as a foundation for the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle climate regulations raises significant concerns. As Hausfather noted, it's going to be the basis for a lot of litigation. This situation invites us to reflect. How can we ensure that climate science is accurately represented and effectively informs policy decisions?